This is LA Theater Works. I'm Susan Lowenberg. I'm joined now by Robert John Russell, the founder and director of the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, an organization dedicated to fostering dialogue between the sciences and world religions. Dr. Russell is the Ian G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science at the Interfaith Consortium, the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He is also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Dr. Russell, welcome to LA Theater Works, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Susan, for having me.
We are used to thinking about science and faith as two strongly opposing sides of an argument. But how far back do we see real sustained efforts in bringing the two together?
The progress began in the 50s and 60s, where massive changes in the philosophy of science and in theology and in science itself began to open up new windows for conversation that are respectful of both sides of the partnership. And so over the last 5 to 6 decades, we've seen amazing progress, both in my own persuasion as a Christian in light of science, my PhDs in physics, but also in, as you said, the much wider inter-religious conversation around a variety of sciences in the natural and social sciences.
When you say there were changes in thinking that came about in the 50s, can you give us some examples of that?
In philosophy of science, in the 60s, actually, we had major breakthroughs right here on the UC campus. Thomas Kuhn discovered that, in fact, physics is involved in a whole series of criteria that transcend empirical data. How do you choose between theories on the basis of their simplicity and elegance, the consensus of a community? Lots of aesthetic and philosophical arguments going into how physics actually works. And that opened up the door beyond seeing it purely as a kind of recipe for plugging data into formulas. In Christian theology, at least, in the 50s and 60s, we began to see the rise of liberation theologies. You began to see the end of the hegemony of sort of new orthodoxy for Protestants. And, of course, Vatican II for Catholics was a watershed of an agenda of opening up conversation with culture. And then just basic discoveries in the sciences, starting with quantum mechanics in 1900 all the way through Bell's theorem about non-locality in the 60s, the discovery of Big Bang cosmology and the beginning of the universe in the 60s, the revolutions in molecular biology in the discovery of the genetic basis for much of human traits. All of these just compelled us to a much wider and more respectful view of what science is about and the profound questions that science raises, but science can't always answer. And the agenda was then to begin this conversation between science, philosophy, and theology.
Why do you believe it is necessary for science and theology to be in a dialogue together? What is the benefit to each in doing so?
Well, there's some really sort of obvious practical benefits because science and technology raise questions from stem cells to cloning to end-of-life, beginning-of-life questions that are fundamentally important to all of us as persons, whether or not we're religious. But science can't really answer them. You really need to turn to ethics and philosophy and to the world religions and their wisdom to try to address these questions. So you really can't engage in these issues without having some bridge across which responsible traffic can flow, which respects both sides, but really sees value added to it. As far as Christian theology goes, it's always been engaged with culture. I mean, in a certain sense, I'm here as a Christian because of Paul reaching out beyond Judaism to the Greco-Roman culture. Augustine was hugely in dialogue with Neoplatonism of his time, Aquinas with Aristotle, the Reformation with the Renaissance. Theology has always been engaged with culture, and today's culture, at least in many parts of the West, is widely shaped by science and technology. So it's natural to have that conversation. What's really surprising is what a hard job it was for some of the pioneers in the 50s and 60s and 70s to get this conversation going.
I'd like to talk about the concept of truth. How do you think science and faith define truth differently? How does that affect their ability to find common ground on what truth is?
Great question. A simple but not very helpful answer is to say that we people verify what we think is true by our experience, right? And we just test things by intuition. And in the traditions we come out of, science has a much more empirical way of testing the truth of statements by data, of course. But in a wider sense, there are questions that you could raise about science in its truth capacity, which transcend science's ability to do experiments. So, for example, why is it worth doing science? Or why does empirical data count towards the truth? Why is it that the universe is knowable by us? Why is it the universe is intelligible and representable by mathematical equations, for example? Why do we believe these equations, Newton's equations or Einstein's equations, carry truth as such? Not just whether they're the right ones technically, but why are they significant? So the questions about the sort of general procedure of science or its general framework of meaning raise questions of truth that transcend sort of technical questions in science, like which is the right theory of gravity. And those are all aesthetic, philosophical questions which go back to the roots of science in the Greco world and the Jewish Christian tradition, because it was the assumption that first the universe is intelligible because it's created by God that allows us to think that science could, in fact, obtain truth about the world. If you believe you can only find out what's true by going out and looking, then the scientific method based on empirical data really counts for truth. But that assumption that you can only find truth that way, the meta-level assumption, comes out of the Logos tradition of the Greeks and out of the ex nihilo creation tradition of the Bible. So in a very beautiful sense, the truth claims of science are verified by science, but the capacity to have truth claims by an empirical method is a presupposition of science based on the biblical and Greek traditions.
And how would religion or faith-based kinds of thinking define truth? For example, I'm just thinking about the opening of Genesis and that God created the world in 6 days and on the seventh day he rested. Is that truth?
What that is a retelling of the biblical faith in God after the exile when the Jews came back from Babylon. They had discovered an amazing culture there and a huge cosmology of very detailed architecture. And what they did, and this is what's so incredible about the Genesis story, is they retold the simple nomadic people's creation myth of the Garden of Eden. They retold that story in light of the truth of the Babylonian cosmology, but they claimed that for Yahweh God, not for the Babylonian gods. So in fact, the Babylonian cosmology, which was pagan, was appropriated by them as the best theory of the universe they had, and they used it to proclaim their faith in God.
But when we read the Bible today, in terms of our definition of what the truth is based on everything we now know about science, it's very hard for people to use the word truth, or people who perhaps do not consider themselves creationists. It's hard for us to use the word truth in conjunction with that story today.
Well, I think you're right if you mean a literal reading. If we read the Bible literally, then of course it's going to be discounted by science. And most Christian theologians that I work with in the Protestant and Catholic traditions have long since given up a literal reading of the Scripture. But that doesn't mean you give up the truth of Scripture any more than you give the truth of the Constitution by saying, well, technically the Constitution gives equal rights to white male landowners. But we say all people are equal. So that's an interpretation of a normative statement in the political arena. So that you have to grasp the truth of the Bible not through its words, but through its charisma or its message. So Augustine had this wonderful saying, the Bible doesn't tell you how the heavens go, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven.
So truth becomes more fungible. It becomes almost a metaphor for faith in a way, in theology. But is truth more relative today in science?
Well, in a sense, yes, but it's a really delicate problem because on the one hand, you don't want to read scientific texts literally either. Okay, the Big Bang says the universe is expanding, but how can the universe be expanding? What's it expanding into? So it's obviously not a literal statement, but it's obviously a true statement. So how do you read it? Well, you talk about distance between galaxies or something. So that the truth capacity of Big Bang theory has to be gotten through the symbols and metaphors it uses, like expanding universe. And I think we're more aware of that, especially in physics because of quantum mechanics. That quantum mechanics is probably the best theory we have, and yet it can be interpreted in a half dozen different ways, any one of which might be the right way, but we don't know which is which. So the truth of quantum mechanics in one sense is its equations and their power to make predictions, which are incredible. But if you look at a deeper level and say, well, is quantum mechanics true? Is it refer to the world? Is the world really indeterministic and non-local? Well, it's a very hard question to assess. So what I want to do is place this idea of truth more on a continuum between theological assertions and scientific ones. But on the other hand, to emphasize, as I did at the beginning, that theology also embraces things that go beyond an empirical test, but are tested by you as a person and you in the community you're in.
What percentage of the scientific and the theologian communities are actually willing to have this dialogue? and be open to this dialogue between science and faith?
Well, again, a great question, Susan. I mean, the dialogue you and I are having now, it's a very small percentage. But the fact that there's any percentage is a miracle because it wasn't 50 years ago. So, I mean, one is infinitely bigger than zero. Okay. So we're here. There are hundreds of scholars, scientists, and theologians around the world in this conversation. On the other hand, there's a much bigger community which sees it in warfare, just as you said. And so you've got the Weinbergs and Dawkins and Hawkings of the world saying these two are in warfare, and you have the fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Jews and Muslims as well saying, yes, there's a warfare. And then you have a lot of scientists who just don't really think about it, and a lot of Christian theologians who don't think about it. So it's a small, but I think very growing group, and it's significant that it has grown because these questions are really complicated. It's not a simple question. It really involves all sorts of subtle aspects and disciplines that come into the conversation.
And where do ordinary people fit into this debate? How should your average person interpret, say, a theologian's opinion on a scientific question or vice versa?
Well, let's take the tsunami a couple of Christmases ago. A lot of folks had a very natural reaction. Why did this happen to me? What a lot of theologians said was it didn't happen to you as a direct act of God. It happened to you as a consequence of the laws of nature. It happened to you because of gravity, because of the properties of water. It's incompressible. So you get a wave. And what that did was the theologians looked at the problem through the lens of science and said, the tsunami is a natural phenomena given these conditions. It's not a direct act of God causing grief and destruction to people. Now, that's a very important statement. It's a very pastoral statement to make. It doesn't relieve the problem of the suffering, but it certainly allows you to trust God if you don't think God's behind the suffering in your life. So here's a wonderful example of a very simple truth from physics, how tsunamis are created and behave, which was incorporated by a lot of pastors and theologians in trying to address this question. And we can play the same scenario out with everyday questions about we have 4,000 to 6,000 human diseases that we now know are not caused by invasion of the microbe, but they're caused by our own genes. So where is God in that? That's a very important question in a pastoral setting when someone is diagnosed with cancer. And it goes on where science actually comes in and opens up the question afresh. But the questions are very personal, related to family and friends and parents and the community you're in.
But, I think to some extent, because the Bible is such an important factor in the consciousness of people, and it's so filled with stories about the vengeance of God, about redemption, about bad behavior being dealt with by this avenging God, and so on, that even though many people no longer take the Bible literally, it's very difficult, I think, sometimes to move away from that because it's so much in our DNA. There's something there from your earliest childhood that, these myths that are, I think, difficult in a way to completely get away from if you're a person of faith at all.
Yeah. Well, you're right, Susan. I mean, there's no question about it that, as you say, these myths, and they are myths, are in our DNA. What I want to say are two things. First, I am in the United Church of Christ, and that denomination, along with many others, really has broken with the avenging God sort of scenario. It doesn't mean we don't believe in social justice. We don't believe that God's on the side of the oppressed. But it does mean that we have broken with the language of a personalized God who, wreaks vengeance or who seems arbitrary, the kind of God you meet in the first chapters of Job. That's simply put aside as a part of a culture which we are no longer involved in. But the truth behind it is still there. And so we worship God on Sunday and sing God's praise. We refer to God as creator, not father, because the word father seems so loaded to people because it seems to suggest that God is an anthropomorphic super person who's male. Second is, if you give up the Bible entirely, which a lot of folks do, you still need to answer life's basic questions. What do you believe is true? What are you willing to live your life around? What are your values? How do you shape your decisions? What do you believe about life and death? And so where do you get that from? You may get it from philosophy. You may get it from a different system, Buddhism or Hinduism. Or you may try to get it from science. Someone like Carl Sagan was saying, look, it isn't that we shouldn't be religious, that we should have the right source of it, and that source is science. But can science in itself, can the theory of gravity or of genetic variation give you the answer to the question, how should I love my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? What love is healing love? What love is suppressed demonic love? So the questions are still there. And it's a challenge for everyone, Christian, Jew, Muslim, atheist, to find a way to address those questions.
In one of your papers, you paraphrase Robert Jastrow of NASA's Goddard Institute, talking about the study of the Big Bang. He said that scientists had climbed the arduous mountain of cosmology only to find theologians there already. How is the Big Bang a common link between science and theology?
Great question. Yeah, that's from Ms. Scott in the Astronomer's book. Just let me say something about Robert Jastrow's comment. It can be read as being really supportive of theology, that we have something to say and we have some wisdom about the cosmos. Or it can be read as a kind of parody of the arrogance of theologians to think we always had the answer. And I don't want to read it that way, because I don't think the Bible gives you answers to questions like that. So stepping back, his point was this, of course, since general relativity in the first decades of the 20th century, we've had growing evidence that the universe is expanding. Evidence became pretty impressive in the 60s. Penzias and Wilson got Nobel Prizes for discovering microwave background radiation, which is a relic left over from the Big Bang. And it seemed pretty conclusive that there really was a beginning point, an absolute beginning point. Now, pause the scientific story, and then let's go into its interpretation. Is that significant for faith in God? And there's a whole spectrum of answers. Some have said, yes, it's very significant. Pope Pius XII thought so and made some public pronouncements of it. Some have thought it's very significant, but because they're atheists, have rejected it. So Fred Hoyle, an outstanding scientist, was an adamant atheist. And by the 50s, by then, he was so outraged by the sort of Christians claiming Big Bang as evidence for God that he created a separate theory of gravity and solved his equations and produced a theory called the steady state, in which the universe is expanding, of course, otherwise it wouldn't be scientific. But it's expanding forever. It's expanding exponentially, has no beginning point. And I really salute that, because to me, it's a good example of taking science really seriously within your own religious framework, which for Hoyle was atheism, and then being so committed to his atheism that he actually did good science because of it. He produced a theory which for 2 decades was great. You couldn't choose empirically between Big Bang and steady state. So hats off to someone who actually produces a scientific theory because of their religious beliefs, right? I mean, that's an amazing story. Now, it was disconfirmed, but so was T equals 0. So both sides had some pros and cons to it. That is, those who thought T equals 0 supported God began to lose that leverage when Alan Guth and others in the 80s began talking about an inflationary view of the universe, which would account for many of the features that look designed and would get around the problem of T equals 0. And then recently, people like Andre Lindy at Stanford and many others have talked about eternal inflation, where our universe comes from an earlier sort of meta-universe, and there's no beginning to the whole structure of meta-universes. So my point, because I have doctoral students who want to get their PhD and to get a career talking about these things, is you've got to find a way to keep the conversation going. It's kind of like a log roll. And as science changes, you want to be in conversation. So you look for various aspects of these theories that you could talk about in light of Christian faith or in light of atheism, and in the process applaud those who found some real significance, like the Christians who made arguments for God out of T equals 0, and someone like Hoyle, who sort of defeated the T equals 0 argument scientifically for his religious reasons.
These discussions among people who have a great deal of knowledge and sophistication, both about science and theology, of course, are incredibly important and interesting. But I keep thinking about the fact that we're still having this discussion in the United States about whether you can teach evolution in the public schools. It's something that engages a great many ordinary Americans, and people are passionate about it on both sides. And it seems to me a bit disturbing that we are still having that conversation, that somehow the kinds of things you and your fellow theologians and scientists are trying to discuss and parse and understand in ways that are very inclusive and interesting and important are not filtering down to ordinary people.
Oh, I agree. Thanks, Susan. It can be discouraging. It's a cup is half empty, half full. It can also be encouraging that, in fact, the voice is getting out. I mean, you've got me in the show. That's wonderful. There are large movements in our culture that do talk about science and religion in this way. My take on it is that when you shift to the intelligent design creationist controversy or the Milton atheist controversy, I think we're looking more at a culture war It isn't just about can you teach evolution in high school biology classes, which of course you can. It's really a culture war in which there already are vested interests in winning more than, let's say, the truth. And at that point, it's left the realm of sort of mutual conversation, and it's a battleground with sides chosen up, and then you try to make arguments for your side to win. And once we're at that level, it's very hard to go back and say, wait a second, what exactly was the reason why you should teach ID in high school biology classes?
ID meaning intelligent design.
Intelligent design.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Sorry. So what I'm getting at is, like anything, abortion, whatever, once you've got an issue which is so hot and explosive and it divides people so much, then those divisions sort of self-propagate. And it's very hard for scholars to get in that conversation and say, time out, everybody out of the pool. Let's think about the underlying issues. We've done a lot of work like that. There are programs that are being funded to do that kind of outreach work, to say to people, your faith really isn't at stake here. Science really isn't being challenged. But it's hard to bring peace in a culture war environment. If people want to fight, they're going to fight.
In his most recent book, The Grand Design, the physicist Stephen Hawking says that it is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. How influential is Hawking in these discussions, and how has his own position changed over time?
Well, let me just say he's very influential in the level of the culture wars. That is, he and Carl Sagan, who wrote the introduction to his earlier book, The Brief History of Time, really seemed committed to the flaming Sagan saying, well, if there's no t equals 0 beginning of the universe, nothing left for God to do. That's enough to get a Christian to get up in arms.
Right.
And of course it's a nonsense statement, but if you think it's true, and if you believe that the prestige of someone like Hawking, which is unquestionable as a scientist, somehow translates into expertise in something he doesn't have expertise in, then you've got the problem of Stephen says that, and we all have to respond. Tragically, for 25 years, a lot of people, including myself, have written in detail trying to track through Hawking's argument with care. And the bottom line is that he's changed his mind. In Brief History of Time, he actually used that same sort of phrase. Nothing can explain what brings these equations to life, what sets them on fire. The idea is just because you have equations which describe the universe, you haven't explained why the universe exists. To exist is in a different category than to exist with a certain pattern which can be described by physics. So physics cannot explain why there is anything. It can only explain how changes happen within what there is. Now, for some reason, he's written a new book in which he takes back the position. I think it's sad because the position in the earlier book was much more subtle. He recognized the ontological shock that there's a universe and said he can't explain why there is one. And now he's saying, well, the equations do. So to me, it's a retreat to a much more naive view of what science can and can't explain in principle.
Let's talk for a moment about the concept of end days. Where do we find common ground between scientists and theologians when talking about the end of the world?
The most obvious answer is there is no common ground. Christians believe in the end of the universe or a transformation to a new universe. They believe it began with the resurrection of Christ, and it involved the general resurrection of the dead, and the usual sort of story that you get in church. And scientists say quite firmly that the universe will either go on for 1,000 billion years and recollapse into a sort of black hole, or it will go on forever and cool and freeze, and that the latter is much more likely. So on the surface, you have a direct contradiction. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the goal that CTNS is about, my center and other centers, is not to avoid conflict. It's to simply allow genuine conflict to be exposed as a conflict and then to talk about it in a mutually responsible way. So it's to say science and religion per se are not in conflict. It's not a global war. But there can be definite problems within any relationship, even any good partnership. You can have arguments, and you can say, look, there's a genuine difference here. So I want to start by acknowledging that there really does seem to be a conflict about what the future is from a Christian perspective and from a, say, cosmologist perspective.
In this present climate, do you see science and theology working closer together or moving further apart, and why?
Well, again, great question. I think science has its own agenda. Science does science, and it does it beautifully. It's theology's task to take science seriously. It isn't science's task to take theology seriously in the same way. The data of theology, like resurrection of Christ isn't a data for science. So in one sense, it's a one-way street. Theology must engage culture and bring its normativity and its interpretive powers to culture. And culture, for me, includes science, and for me specifically physics. Then after having said that, there's the circle where you get someone like Fred Hoyle, let's say, who is a passionate believer in atheism and is able to make the connection to his own physics. Well, that's great. He's free to do that. He did it magnificently. So it isn't theology telling science what to do, but it might be a scientist who has a theological viewpoint being inspired to do their science in a different way. And you can tell the same story about Niels Bohr and Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger. Each of them were deeply influenced by one or another of the world religions. Schrödinger with Vedanta and Bohr with existentialism. The yin-yang was his personal crest, and he was highly influenced by Kierkegaard. There are philosophical and theological resources out there, and scientists are people, and people engage in those in various ways. So almost any distinguished scientist will in some ways represent one of those points of view. Charlie Towns is a good friend, Nobel Prize for the laser, deeply influenced by his Christian tradition. So I don't think theology influences science, but I think scientists may be influenced by their own wider views of the world as they do their science.
It is fascinating to me how many scientists are able to have faith. They may utilize it or think about it in ways that we may not. But it is interesting to me that in the middle of this elegant idea that physics has, that the elegance and the perfection sometimes of these formulas does not mean that people cannot also be capable of being engaged with something that is a little messier and less known.
Well, I think you're right to point out the aesthetic component of science, especially mathematical physics, because these equations are truly gorgeous. And you can be a believer or not a believer. Any world religion still recognize the absolute stunningness of the Dirac equation or general relativity. And I think that's one reason why it's so enthralling and why you spend your whole life solving an equation. I still do that. I love science. But the question which you may or may not want to raise, but I like to raise, is whether or not there's something deeper there to that experience. That is, what is it about the human spirit that's responding to the beauty of a mathematical equation that describes nature? And that's where the deeper meaning of faith comes in, not just faith that the universe is knowable and these equations reflect it and that they're beautiful, but that in some ways they reflect something about the whole purpose of the universe, that why are we, you and I, living in the universe which has this deep aesthetic, which is reflected in the equations of science. And that closer and closer gets to the idea of a source of that aesthetic. God, the tradition's always said that God is related to the real, the true, and the beautiful, and the good. And those four dimensions of culture come together in a notion of God as its source.
But they are also a wonderful description of science.
That's right. In that sense, science is a path to an experience of God that can be enormously, overwhelmingly beautiful. And yet it's about nature much more than the domain of, say, scripture or inward experience.
So what are your suggestions for how scientists and theologians can continue to find a middle path together?
Well, I think it's important to set aside the culture wars. I mean, maybe you have to get involved sometimes in them. We all have our sort of civic duty, but they're really a loss. I think they're going to be here for longer than you and I. The real task is for theologians not to be afraid of science, not to think that the atheists, the militant atheists who speak for science only, that they don't have a claim on science. They're really speaking for themselves. And to listen to the many, many scientists who are devout Muslims and Jews and Christians and Buddhists and Hindus. We've had a 7-year program, international program, of highlighting these folks. We made the cover of Newsweek magazine in 1998 talking about science and faith for distinguished scientists. So I think it's important for theologians to realize they can't avoid this part of culture, and they shouldn't be afraid of it because some people in that part of culture claim science for atheism dogmatically. I think it's really important for pastors to be able to talk to their people about science and its beauty, the discoveries of the universe we could never have made without science, and their importance, like gene-based diseases that we could never cure with a flu shot. It's so important to recognize that the questions we all ask about our origins and our destiny, however we answer them, are questions that have to do with science and our view of the universe and how we're part of it and how we're distinct from it. And I think it's really helpful for scientists to know that there's a welcoming culture, a much wider welcoming culture, that their discoveries can be honored for the diligence and the incredible self-sacrifice that went into making them, and that they can be given a home and appreciated for their beauty and for what they reveal about human nature and the technologies they lead to. As long as the scientists aren't themselves hammering away at culture saying, we've got the truth and nothing but the truth, and if you don't do it scientifically, it couldn't be true. So both sides need to put down those totalizing arguments for literalism and dogmatic universalism and recognize our common humanity, the overwhelming challenges we have, the need for these ethical questions to be brought to the conversation around science, the aesthetic questions, and finally the meaning of it all kinds of questions, which really we mean by faith.
Dr. Russell, thanks for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Susan.
I've been speaking with Dr. Robert John Russell, the founder of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences and the editor of Physics, Philosophy, and Theology, A Common Quest for Understanding.